So we're going to begin with the textual story, a story that was created, we think, around 500 BC, but in fact was set 2,000 years before that. One of the most important figures in that story, Yao, the Emperor Yao. If we take the early textual record and look at that in terms of the kinds of ways in which people understood the beginning of civilization, then they typically begin with culture heroes. And by this I mean that they're not gods. It's very important, they're not gods. They are human figures who do things that are beneficial to civilization. These stories do not begin with the creation of the world. They do not begin with some figure outside of the world who creates it and gives it to humankind. Humans are in the world, but they are no different from animals. And the culture heroes, in a sense, are transforming humankind into us, into civilized beings. Humans were fighting with animals to survive, and the culture heroes create nets so they can fish and feed themselves, create hoes so that they can dig and plant grain so they don't have to be hunters. Basically, it's saying they change them from hunter and gatherers to fishermen and farmers. So we can see in these early stories that certain figures, people, individuals, human leaders, come forth and invent things, create things that will be beneficial to human life, to the human community. This is, in some sense, a big idea about Chinese civilization, that civilization exists to improve the lives of people, to improve the lives of humans, and to bring order and proper arrangement to human society. I'm going to skip a number of figures that we could talk about. The Yellow Emperor, for example, is a famous one. Shen Nung, or the divine farmer or husbandman, is another, and jump right into the three figures of Yao, Shun, and Yu. These are the figures with which the Book of Documents, the Classic of Documents, begins. And the story goes something like this, that Yao suddenly appears, he's named, it said, you look back, he did all these things. But what did Yao do? In some sense, Yao is inventing government. This, by the traditional chronology, this would have been around 2,400 years BC. But when we read the text, what we see is that Yao pays attention to the cycles of the sun and moon, and with that, he creates a calendar so that the agricultural seasons could follow their proper course. But he has two kinds of calendars. He has a solar calendar, which is necessary for agriculture, and a lunar calendar, which is necessary for counting the months. And he brings these two into congruence. He delegates his authority to officials of the four quarters. So in other words, he says, you will go out and govern on my behalf. Everything doesn't have to go to me. And finally, he harmonizes the many people over whom he ruled. Now, this notion of harmonizing ought to remind us a bit of some of the slogans in China today of the Hexie Shehui, the harmonious society. And although they don't use the exact word Hexie in these ancient documents, they do use the word harmonious as that which Yao is doing to the peoples. So Yao turns to the natural world, the sun and the moon, heaven and earth in the Chinese parlance, for models of organization. There's no intelligent design in this world. The emperor, the ruler, the king looks to that world and says, these are the models I will follow. He learns how to delegate authority, and he learns that government's role is to bring harmony to the world. But there's something else that Yao does that's very important, and that comes up with the figure of Shun, the second ruler, the one to whom Yao gives the world, to improve the lives of humans, and to bring order and proper arrangement to human society. When Yao is old and about to die, he says to his ministers, his chief officials, tell me, who should I appoint as my successor? And the ministers say, oh, your son, why not your son? And Yao says, my son is arrogant, he's quarrelsome, he will not do. We must find a person, and we must find the right person, and the way we should do that is we should look for people of certain qualities. And so they send out to find who it is who it is that will have qualities that are desirable in a ruler. And they settle on the person called Shun, a commoner. And what is it that Shun did? What is it that Shun did? Well, it turned out he had a very nasty father, an evil stepmother, a horrible stepbrother. His whole family around him turned against him, and Shun still stayed with his family, and he harmonized them. He brought them into concord. He brought them to peace. And so Yao said, Shun is the man to give rule to. And Yao gave him his 2 daughters as wives to further test him. And thus Shun became the ruler. And the big idea here, and a very important one, is rule by the worthy. It's not your family, it's not who you are that gives you the right to power. Rather, it's your worthiness. And Shun had proved himself worthy. Shun goes on, and as we read about Shun in the Book of Documents, to elaborate on the government that Yao had created. He creates rituals, that is ceremonies. He creates ranks and insignia that order people by their clothing. He tries to balance providing moral models of behavior or models of moral behavior with laws and punishments. He defines punishments for every crime. By the way, in this, or already at this point in China, we see that crimes are punished worst by execution, by exile, by beatings, but not by imprisonment. Imprisonment, until modern times, was not part of the Chinese criminal system, except holding people over for trial. He offers sacrifices to the many gods and spirits. He takes inspection tours of the land. And here, to get to sort of the big idea of Shun's reign, Shun begins to see that the political system also is a social system. And to make society work, you have to have a political system that also organizes society. But then Shun grows old and meets various challenges. And one of the great challenges he meets is a flood, a terrible flood that floods all the land. And to deal with the flood, he calls upon a man called Yu. And eventually, because of Yu's great success, he will be appointed as the successor to Shun. But what is it? What is it that Yu does? The flood is spread over the lands. The roads, there are no more roads. Everything is impassable. There are no connections between the various regions anymore. Shun goes out and travels, and he begins to channel the rivers, drain the rivers, move the land so that the land could dry out and the rivers would flow into the sea. I'd like to sort of think about this for a minute as a contrast with what I read when I was small about Noah and the ark. Because God says to Noah, Noah, build an ark, put the animals on it, and wait. Wait for the storm. When the storm's over, take the animals off the ark, which is what Noah does. From Yu's perspective, Noah is entirely passive. He listens to somebody tell him what to do, he does it, and everything gets settled. In the Chinese case, and I would suggest this is the big idea, the big lesson that comes from the story of Yu. Man overcomes nature. Man conquers nature, can overcome the greatest challenges. He can move mountains. He can move rivers. He can save humanity. If you think about that as a story of China, not the story that I was once taught when I began studying Chinese history, that Chinese were passive in the face of nature, that the West conquered nature, the Chinese simply accorded with it and fit themselves to it. This story of Yu is the story that goes right down to the Three Gorges Dam, which says we can channel the rivers. We can move nature around to benefit humankind. Now, Shun gives the world, all the world under heaven, to Yu to rule, and Yu rules well. But when Yu gets old, he gives it to his son. And his son gives it to his son, and so forth, until that dynasty, which they call, is known in these texts as the Xia dynasty, is overthrown by the founders of the Shang dynasty. But it is clear, if we take all these stories together, that rule by the worthy is better than dynastic rule. Yu created a dynasty meaning that control over political power, the throne, remained in the hands of a single family until that family was moved off stage. But the ideal of Yao Shunryu is to, in every generation, to find worthy people. This gives us the three dynasties of ancient China according to our textual record: the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. It also gives us a meaning to China as a place where one king rules all, where there's a single line of development going from Yao Shunryu, from the ancient emperors, ancient kings, right down into the present, where rule is ideally by the worthy, and when the purpose of government is to improve the human condition. That's the story we get from these texts. That's the meaning of China. And we could ask ourselves, why, in around 500 BC, when these stories are put together, why was this such an appealing story? And the answer is very straightforward. This was a time of states warring against each other, fighting each other. What we now call China splintered into many small feudal states, which the nominal king, the Zhou king, was too weak, too ineffectual to control, and who were constantly fighting each other and taking each other's territories. So the people who put these early stories together, these early origin stories about civilization, were trying to say, this is what the world should be: unified, harmonious, ruled by worthy people who care about our welfare. That was the promise they were trying to create, the vision they were trying to create with these stories.